take a trip to the past. We've got places to explore. Come along, take a trip to the past to learn about things you never knew before. Field trips to yesterday. Field trips to yesterday. Field trips to yesterday. Come along, we're on our way.
Welcome to Boston, the city that set the American colonies on the road to revolution and independence. In this program, we're going to talk about some of the most important events on that journey. And we are going to hear from a man who speaks and dresses just like Paul Revere, who we all know from the famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. We'll begin our trip to historic Boston in 1763, before the American Revolution, when the 13 colonies that became the United States of America were ruled by England. Each of the 13 colonies was separate and independent, and even though they all had their own governments, the colonists had to obey laws made by the British Parliament and the King. Or did they? Before we can answer that question, we have to go back a little. From 1754 to 1763, the British fought a very costly war against the French in North America. It was called the French and Indian War. American colonials fought right alongside the British Army. In fact, a young Virginian named George Washington rose to the rank of colonel. When the war ended, the British were in debt. Many people in England resented having to support a war in America, and it looked like there might be another war, because the colonists kept moving west, and the British would have to protect them. So, to pay off some of the debt from the French and Indian War, and to stave off the possibility of new wars, the British did a few things. First, Parliament passed the Proclamation of 1763, which said there couldn't be any new settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. This enraged many colonists who thought the king had no right to prevent them from going there. Next, Parliament passed the Quartering Act. This required the colonists to quarter, or house, British soldiers, even in their private homes, and at their own expense. Then, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This law required the colonists to pay a tax, or stamp, for all their papers, newspapers, legal papers, everything. The Stamp Act is important because it was the first time Parliament had even tried to collect taxes in the colonies. The colonists believed that Parliament didn't have that right because they weren't represented in Parliament. The colonists said they could only be taxed by their own local governments. The colonists began to protest. One of the leaders of the protest was Samuel Adams of Boston, who organized a secret society called the Sons of Liberty. The protests were so effective that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. But they also passed a law saying that they had the right to rule the colonies and tax the colonists. And in 1767, they tried that again. This time the laws were called the Townshend Acts. One of the acts imposed new taxes on the colonists. Again there were protests, because what Parliament was really saying was that Englishmen living in America didn't have the same rights as Englishmen living in England. In Boston, many of the protests were held at Faneuil Hall, where leaders like Sam Adams, whose statue now stands in front of Faneuil Hall, called for a boycott of British goods. That meant that the colonists would not purchase anything made in England. They called their policy non-importation. Even though most colonial leaders hoped the protests would be non-violent, that wasn't always the case. Some colonists even went so far as to tar and feather customs officials who tried to collect the taxes. The protests paid off. Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts, and the taxes were lifted. But just to show that they were still in charge, Parliament kept the tax on tea. They also sent more soldiers to Boston. Because of their uniforms, the people called them redcoats, or lobsterbacks. Eventually, it seemed as if Boston was a captured city ruled by soldiers. The resentment against the British grew and grew. But King George III didn't pay much attention to the colonists' complaints, as Paul Revere explains.
We are sending letters and complaints to the king, but there aren't enough of us that are upset with the king to make a loud enough voice. His ministers are not giving him the information. So we need an incident, preferably one with bloodshed, that will draw the king's attention and make him ask what's going on in Boston. And to this end came the Boston Massacre.
The incident that became known as the Boston Massacre began on the afternoon of March 5th, 1770, when a fistfight broke out between a worker and a soldier. It developed into a small riot, and by the evening, bands of citizens were roaming the streets of Boston. A crowd gathered and began to taunt a sentry standing guard outside the building known today as the Old State House. The sentry called for troops to break up the protest. When the redcoats arrived, the crowd threw rocks, sticks, and snowballs. And then someone, no one knows who, fired into the crowd. By the time it was over, 5 colonists had died. One of the dead was Crispus Attucks, who's known today as a martyr for the Revolution. The Boston Massacre was an important turning point. It wasn't only an incident that got the king to pay attention to the colonists, as Paul Revere explained. It was also an event that people like Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty could use to turn public opinion in their favor, even if they had to color the truth. So, Adams asked Paul Revere, who was a silversmith and engraver, to design a special engraving to commemorate the event.
Sam Adams came to me and asked me to make that engraving, and we were going to use that to incite the citizens against the British rule. But we had to bend the truth a bit, because the population is divided pretty much 3 ways. 1/3 of the population is still loyal to the king. Always had one, that's the way it should always be. 1/3 of the population is rebel like myself. We aren't trying to leave England, we're just trying to get our rights as Englishmen that we think we deserve. And the other third is so busy just trying to survive, they don't have time for politics. They care not whether they're ruled by a mob or by the king. But we need their voices on our side, and this propaganda is to draw them to our cause.
Boston wasn't the only place where there was trouble. In New York, for example, the colonial government was suspended because the people wouldn't obey the Quartering Act. But the colonial leaders had difficulty communicating with each other. Remember, this was a time without telephones, TV, radio, or the internet. So, in 1772, at a town meeting, Sam Adams called for the creation of a committee of correspondence to enable Boston to stay in touch with its neighbors. Eventually, a system of couriers was established, and writers like Paul Revere went from town to town and colony to colony spreading vital news and information. After the Town Sand Acts were repealed, things calmed down, and many in England and America hoped the troubles were over. But the calm didn't last long. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which granted the East India Company the right to import tea into the colonies. The company could sell tea at very low prices, just about putting colonial merchants out of business, and the colonists who bought the tea still had to pay a tax. The Tea Act affected all the colonies. Protests broke out everywhere. In New York and Philadelphia, boats carrying the tea were kept from entering the harbor. In Charleston, the tea was unloaded and put in damp cellars to rot. Boston came up with a different protest. On the night of December 16th, 1773, a band of men disguised as Indians boarded 3 British ships docked in Boston Harbor and dumped all the tea on board, 342 chests, into the harbor. This protest became known as the Boston Tea Party, and it was the spark that lit the Revolution. Now the colonists had the king's attention. George III was outraged. This was defiance that called for drastic measures. The colonists must be punished. The port of Boston was closed to traders and would stay closed until all the tea was paid for. All committees of correspondence were forbidden, and Massachusetts was placed under the command of General Thomas Gage and his army. The laws were so intolerable, that's what the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts.
Life in Boston after the Tea Party was very restricted. General Gage arrived, bringing 5 more regiments of soldiers. This made 10 regiments in the city of Boston, a population of 11,000 people. That means 4,500 soldiers, not counting children. That's 1 soldier for every 2 people. We must be dangerous.
The British were convinced that Boston was the source of rebellion for all the colonies. They thought punishing the Bostonians would show the other colonies what would happen if they defied British rule. But instead of quieting the other colonies, the Intolerable Acts drew all the colonies together. So, on September 5th, 1774, delegates from every colony, except Georgia, came to Philadelphia to discuss what they could do together to settle their problems with the British. The meeting was the First Continental Congress. One of the representatives from Massachusetts was Sam Adams. Many of the delegates from other colonies were astonished by Adams and his opinions. They thought he was far too radical. But the Congress gave colonial leaders the opportunity to talk to each other face to face for the first time. Before the First Continental Congress adjourned, the delegates wrote a petition to the king in which they demanded their rights and liberties as Englishmen. And they pledged to meet again the following May if the king didn't agree to their demands. By the spring of 1775, it was clear that the king had no intention of listening to the Americans, so the colonists made preparations to defend themselves. All of the colonies had local armies called militias. The difference between a militia and a regular army is that the soldiers in a militia are ordinary citizens. The soldiers in a regular army are professional soldiers. In Massachusetts, the best of the militia were organized into groups called minute companies. These minutemen could be armed and ready to fight at a minute's notice. As tensions between the colonists and the British grew, the militia and the ammunition that was stored took on a new meaning, as Paul Revere explains.
Each village and town in the colony has a powder house where extra guns and ammunition are stored for the use of the militia that we used during the French and Indian War to help protect the colony. But now General Gage realizes these same guns can be used against his soldiers. He wants to go into the countryside and bring them back. He's starting with the largest amounts first.
The Americans and the British kept a careful eye on each other. The Sons of Liberty set up a system where messengers would ride through the countryside, spreading the word if there was any movement by the Redcoats. On the other side, General Thomas Gage kept an eye out for any unusual buildup of the Minutemen's ammunition. Rumor had it that he was particularly interested in capturing the large supply of arms stored at Concord, 18 miles from Boston. But when would the Redcoats march? By watching carefully, the Americans figured out that the British were going to make their move to Concord on the night of April 18th. Now they needed to know which route the British would take.
Now the question was, which way would they go? See, Boston is shaped like a big island, and there was one road going due south across Roxbury Neck. For the soldiers to march out of the city, they would have to leave their camp on the Common, march south across the neck, go west far enough to clear the harbor, and then come north to Cambridge. At Cambridge, they could take the Boston Road, march straight through Lexington on their way to Concord. The only other way is by boat. Now, is there an ocean in Lexington and Concord? Can you sail a ship there? No. By boat means they will be ferried for them camp on the Common, across the Charles River, almost a mile wide at this point, landed in Cambridge, and then again get the Boston Road, march straight west to Concord. The difference? Almost 10 miles of march and 6 hours of time. If you were going to lead a raid in the cover of night, which way would you go? We woke up on the morning of the 18th. We had our answer. Behind all the warships anchored about the harbor, they are now towing their long rowboats. These are normally kept in cradles up on the deck. But being wood, the wood shrinks and the seams open up. So to make these boats ready for their heavy night's work, they've been put in the water early so they can swell up tight. Now we know which way they are going.
Once they knew the route, the colonials had to let their riders know so they could warn the countryside. A plan had been set up earlier. Lanterns would be placed in the steeple of the Old North Church. 1 lantern if the soldiers were going to Concord by land. 2 lanterns if they were going by sea. So Paul Revere went to Robert Newman, the caretaker of the Old North Church, to set the plan in motion.
The night of the 18th, when I had asked him to put up the signals, I told him there would be 2. He left his home down the street, came to the front door of that church with a friend, Robert Pulling. Together they unlocked the front door of that church using the only key in existence. Newman slipped inside. Pulling locked him in. Newman made his way to the top of the steeple, and from a hiding place drew 2 glass lanterns, lit first one and then the other. He held them up to the window for a few minutes. And in his mind's eye, he could see the men of Charlestown stopping their work at dusk to look to the steeple to see if there's a signal this night. When they saw it, they left their work behind and rode out across Charlestown Neck to warn the countryside.
With the signal given, messengers rode out into the night to warn their countrymen. But Paul Revere was given a special task.
About mid-morning, I am summoned by Dr. Warren. He is the head of the Sons of Liberty. He has called for William Dawes and myself. He told us he has a special job for us. He needs us to go to Lexington to warn John Hancock and Sam Adams. They are our newly elected representatives to Continental Congress. And with them is a chest of papers, documents written by men like myself and Warren and signed. In an English court of law, they can be considered treason and hang us all. Our job this night is only to go to Lexington to get Hancock, Adams, and these papers out of harm's way. I arrived in Lexington an hour later. We covered 16 miles in an hour's time. When I rode up to the Clark House, hollering as I arrived, Sergeant Monroe of the Lexington Militia was standing guard out front. "Shh! Quiet! Don't make any noise! They've gone to bed for the night. Don't wish to be disturbed." Said, "Noise? You'll have noise enough before morning. The regulars are out." I never said the British were coming. We were all British and proud of it. Monroe realized the danger and woke up Hancock and Adams. Dawes arrived about 15 minutes later. Together we tried to convince Hancock and Adams to be on their way. Now our night's work was done. This is all that we had been asked to do. So we went down to Buckman Tavern to refresh ourselves. And there we decided to push on to Concord. It's only 8 more miles. Want a job done right? Best do it yourself. So we get on our horses. And as we start out of Lexington, for the first time we stop at the houses that we pass to warn the inhabitants. As we are doing this, another rider comes by. His name is Dr. Samuel Prescott. He identifies himself as a Son of Liberty through the use of one of these medallions that I had made up for all of us. Asked what we were about, and we told him. He told us some of the houses this way were still loyalist. Should we knock on the wrong door to the middle of the night, we might be shot. So he comes with us. We finished our work in Lexington, crossed over into Lincoln. And there, as we go down a barren stretch of road, we came to some trees. 4 riders sprang out to block our road. We turned to escape. Other riders have circled behind us. We were trapped. Prescott says, "Make a diversion. I know the area. I can get away." Now, my horse had been used badly this night. She had no run left in her. So I reared my horse up and turned her in a bit of a circle. As the soldiers converged on me, Prescott jumps a fence and across a meadow with Dawes right behind him. Well, poor Dawes got lost in the woods that night, so he never got to Concord. But Prescott did, and the men of Concord were warned.
In the early morning of April 19th, 1775, the Redcoats reached Lexington. There, they found 70 Minutemen armed and ready for battle. The Redcoats told the colonists to put down their arms. They would not. Then a shot was fired. No one knows who it was who fired the first shot, but it became known as the shot heard round the world. Before the skirmish ended, 8 colonists and 1 British soldier died at Lexington. The Redcoats continued towards Concord. When they reached the Old North Bridge, they were met by more Minutemen. This time the British were forced to retreat. All along the road back to Lexington, the Redcoats were attacked by Minutemen. More than 4,000 Minutemen had answered the call. It was just the beginning, but the Americans had won the day. To deal with the growing hostilities, in May 1775, Congress created a Continental Army made up of soldiers from different colonies. George Washington was named Commander-in-Chief. It's important to understand that establishing an army didn't mean that all the colonists wanted to separate from England. Many remained loyal to the king and hoped that their differences could be resolved. The population was divided into 2 groups, the Patriots, who favored independence, and the Loyalists, who did not. General Washington was ordered to go to Boston and take control of the army. But before he could get there, one of the deadliest battles of the Revolution was fought in the hills above Charlestown. For the British to control Boston, they had to control 2 hills, Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. On the evening of June 16, 1775, the Americans set up their defenses. The next day, the British attacked. The Americans managed to turn them back twice, but finally they ran out of ammunition, and the British took the hill. Even so, the Patriots considered the battle a victory. Their losses were 400. The British lost more than 1,000 soldiers. Today, this monument stands as a tribute to the Battle of Bunker Hill. Incidentally, the monument is really on top of Breed's Hill. That's where the battle was actually fought. The Battle of Bunker Hill firmly established the Patriots' cause. Still, not everyone was convinced that separation from England was necessary. Gradually, though, more and more people came to believe that the colonies should be independent. In June 1776, the Second Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia formed a committee to write a Declaration of Independence. Written by Thomas Jefferson, it spelled out the wrongs the king had done and explained why the colonists wanted a country of their own. After some debate, on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed and approved. One of the signers was Sam Adams. Today, Sam Adams and Paul Revere lie in graves in Granary Burial Ground in Boston. They are surrounded by many fellow patriots, including John Hancock, who signed the Declaration of Independence, and Crispus Attucks, who died in the Boston Massacre. Boston's special contribution to the cause of independence is still celebrated today, on Patriots' Day, April 19th, the anniversary of the Battle of Lexington, where the first shot for freedom rang out. The shot heard round the world.